Check, check. Check, check.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our opening book talk today. You all are the proud and few who were able to make it here right at 8 a.m., but I hope that we'll have more people joining us. So I'm Emma Green. I'm a staff writer with the Atlantic magazine. I cover politics, policy, and religion. And I'm here today with Steve Hilton. Steve, welcome. So he comes to us not recently, but somewhat recently from overseas. He worked for David Cameron and Margaret Thatcher. He has run an organization called CrowdPack. He has a Fox News show called The Next Revolution. And we're here today to talk about his latest book, which is called Positive Populism. And it's all about the case for harnessing the populist spirit we've seen over the last couple of years in particular into specific types of policies. Before we get started, just a few logistical notes. We'll do a few minutes of us talking up here on stage. We'll do a Q&A at the end, so be thinking of your questions. And finally, there will be a book signing that will happen right here in front. So if you're looking for a copy of the book, if you're persuaded by the pitch on stage, that will be available for you. So let's get started with the basics. You told me before we came on stage here that you don't identify as a Brit exactly. You identify as Hungarian. But I'm curious why a Hungarian by way of Britain is the person to come here to America and tell us how to reform our country in a populist way.
Well, I think the great thing about America is that anyone can come here and make a contribution. I hope I'm able to do that. Thank you for the introduction. Thanks to all of you for coming. I'm so happy to be part of this festival. I love the Atlantic, as we were also saying, I love the Atlantic, and it's a great honor to be here. I think that for me, there was a moment, if we take a few steps back, for a long time, I've been involved in one way or another with trying to advance economic, social issues to the benefit, I would argue, of working people and communities. I've tried to pursue that aim through companies that I've started, like a company called Good Business back in the UK that was trying to work with big corporations to address social and environmental problems and so on. Through my work in politics, as you mentioned, back in the UK. I've written previous books about it. One way or another, I've been sort of wrestling with these problems. How do you give people opportunity, economic security? How do you help families? How do you help communities? And what was interesting for me is that for most of that time, to use that label again, I self-identified as a conservative. I was pretty much in the mainstream of conservative thinking, I guess, and also right at the heart of conservative politics. I worked in 10 Downing Street as senior advisor to a conservative prime minister. But there was a moment when all that, I started to sort of question all that, and really it was the Brexit campaign and referendum. But along the way, I'd been starting to question some of those assumptions, those ideological assumptions about conservatism. For example, these things like, well, if you look back at the 80s and the Thatcher economic revolution mirrored here with the Reagan revolution, and the language we used to use about that, a rising tide lifts all boats, free markets, cut big government, all that kind of ideological stuff. The more I worked at the grassroots with communities, with people in the UK through these various efforts, whether that's as a policymaker or in business or working with community organizations, I just realized that's just not true, actually, that all the way through that great conservative political success and the story that was told about economic revival, millions of people were left out of that. And they didn't have economic security. And there's a story about economic opportunity and people rising through if you work hard and do the right thing. All that stuff wasn't true. So I was starting to, in fact, when I worked with David Cameron, both on his campaign to become the Conservative Party leader and in government, the kind of policies that I was helping to develop were criticized by the conservative media in the UK for being unconservative. And I thought, well, who cares? These seem to me the right ways to solve these problems. So in a way, it's been my journey away from that ideological certainty. And the Brexit referendum was the moment when suddenly everything was thrown apart because it split people down party lines. And then this term populism started to be used a lot in a way that I had never really been familiar with. And I thought, well, actually, that makes sense to me as a way of thinking about politics but we need to make it positive. We need to turn it into something that's not just complaining about what's gone wrong, but actually has solutions for how we put it right.
So let's talk about populism. This is one of those elusive words that gets tossed around in our politics quite often. And populism has a long history. There's left populism, there's right populism. And what you're proposing here is sort of a fusion of the two. So I'd love for you to give a working definition of what populism means to you.
So the crispest way I can try and do that is to say that for me, my version of it at least, in a way, the defining thing about it is that it's not ideological. It's pragmatic in its approach and its intent. And it's defined not by ideology, but by interests. Which interests are we trying to advance through populism? And my summary of those is that it's an approach which is pro-worker, pro-family, and pro-community. And you might hear that and say, well, who could be against that? It's a total, platitude to say that. Well, actually, if you look at the way policy has been designed and implemented over the last few decades, it has not been pro-worker at all. Over the last few decades, the balance of power in the economy has shifted from workers to owners. Workers have lost out, and actually we all know that we talk all the time about wage stagnation. Just to take one example of the worker experience, and we sometimes think, well, that's just the last few years and, since the Great Recession. No, I mean, one of the striking bits of data, I open the book with it, is that if you look at the typical American worker, I think the definition from the Census Bureau is the non-managerial and non-supervisory workers. There's 80% or so of the economy. Their wages, adjusted for inflation, have been stagnant since 1972. This is 44 years up till 2016 of wage stagnation. So it's not been pro-worker at all. Pro-family, again, sounds like something we'd all be in favor of. But if you look at what's happened in terms of the family breakdown and the way that impacts children's life chances, that's all going in the wrong direction. Policy has made that worse. And if you talk about pro-community, again, everyone would say they're for that. But in fact, power and control and influence has been taken away from communities and centralized both in the economy and in government and in politics to distant organizations, people who are distant. And that's what I think gives people the sense that they don't control the things that matter in their life, and that's why they're so angry. So pro-worker, pro-family, pro-community, that for me is positive populism.
So at times reading your book, I wondered if perhaps these policies that you're offering are free market, family values conservatism masquerading in populist clothing.
Right.
And so I just would love for you to distinguish between what you're offering here, some of these policy proposals, and what are sort of a typical free market oriented, small government, pro-family conservatism.
I think that's a really important question, and one that I was, funnily enough, it really came to me when I was reading the audio book, where they said, you got to read, you can't have someone else read it because you're on TV now, so it's weird if we hire, an actor or whatever it is, whatever they normally get to read the book. You've got to do it yourself. So I did that, and I spent, 3 or 4 days reading my book out. And so it familiarizes you with the arguments, and partly I just thought, oh, this is quite good. I actually agree with it, which was encouraging. But the other thing that really struck me as I was reading it was that it's in 3 parts: the populist economy, the populist society, populist government. I thought, wow, this first part, this is really quite left-wing in many ways, quite liberal, if you use that label. And then the second part, this feels much more conservative. And then the third part on government felt quite, I would say, more neutral, more sort of government reform wonky, if I can use that term. Do you know what? And so I thought, well, this is an interesting mix. In terms of, I'll pick maybe 2 specific, I mean, it's really an ideas book. I wouldn't dignify them by calling them policies, because they're not fully worked out, costed, all the things you'd expect. They're just ideas, really, to start a conversation. One theme that goes through, and this is maybe the direct way to answer your question about is it free market really, is when I look at some of the things that I advocate, whether that's universal home visiting, which has been identified as one of the best possible ways to help families raise their kids in a way that gives them opportunity.
And just define that really quickly, because that's maybe unfamiliar to some of our American
So,
audience.
although actually, I mean, what it really, the very simple way it works is that, well, let's just take one step back. If you look at family breakdown, which numerous studies, in fact, even the New York Times yesterday, front page story in the Times, really interesting about new data that's very granular about life chances and opportunities at the neighborhood level, tracking families over 30 years. And one of the points made in that, in one of the things emerging from that study was that children who are raised in two-parent households do better on that opportunity measure. One of the interesting bits of data that I found is that when you look at when families break, and you know, I'm trying to get away from this ideological lecturing people about family values and so without any kind of, this is a good example, I think, of what I mean by being pragmatic. Rather than lecturing people about family values, let's look at what actually happens. And it turns out that one of the peak periods for families to break down is within the first year of a first child being born, for very obvious reasons. It's an incredibly stressful time, and you don't get enough sleep, and you're arguing, and it's just a nightmare for many people. And it's particularly a nightmare for people who don't have the resources to get the help that so many people can afford, who are at the top of the economic ladder. So let's try and help those people in practical ways. And it turns out that one of the best ways of doing that is to have a trained professional, typically a nurse, come and visit you in the home as a new parent to give you incredibly practical help and advice. How do you get the baby to sleep? How do you get them to feed properly? How do you help with breastfeeding? There's so many practical things. And we all assume that everyone knows how to do this and there's plenty of resources out there. It's just not true. And one of the most successfully evaluated social programs in the history of these things is actually something called the Nurse Family Partnership, which is actually a US program developed in Colorado in the 70s that does exactly this. It enables, it provides nurses to go into homes. Now, the problem is that's limited to at-risk families. It's a kind of crisis intervention for families who are really in dire need. My argument is, let's do that for everyone. But just to come back to the free market point, that doesn't, it's a good example of a theme throughout the book, which is let's give people services where the government's role is to guarantee that it happens, to pay for it, but it doesn't mean that the government has to deliver it. You can have a market in the delivery of these services. So essentially a kind of voucher approach where, and I use a phrase very often, which is guaranteed by the state, but delivered by the market through non-profits or for-profit companies or social enterprises, whatever it may be. That's a theme throughout the book.
Public-private partnerships, yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to talk along these lines about some of the policy proposals you put forth, or idea proposals,
yes,
that are somewhat taboo in our left-right American political spectrum. And I think family values is a great example of this. You describe family values as something that's been balkanized, on the one hand, into a sort of conservative, traditionalist, anti-divorce, anti-gay marriage set of values on the right. And then on the left, something that is taboo to talk about, you know, seems like it's invasive of people's home lives, a sort of reticence to model what an ideal family looks like. So why do you think it is that trying to build strong families that include two-parent households and give support to people with new children is something that's become so taboo in America's policy landscape? I
think that it's because of the fear of well, first of all, I think one of the reasons politicians and people in public life don't do it is for very understandable reasons. There's a fear of looking like hypocrites. How can I sort of start talking about stable families if my own family situation is a mess, for example? I think that's just a very practical reason that people have shied away from the conversation. I think it's also on the left, it's particularly this idea we can't be judgmental about how people choose to live their lives. My argument is, the way I put it is, okay, that's fine, but this is because of the impact of family breakdown and the lack of stable families on all of us, but not least as taxpayers in terms of the costs of social failure and family breakdown, which are well documented and researched. We can't just privatize it as an issue. We can't just say, well, this is just up to individual people. There's a social cost and social impact that means that we ought to think about it as policymakers. But that doesn't mean you have to be judgmental and narrow in your view of it. For example, I think gay marriage is actually, or marriage equality is a really good example of it, which is, it's always baffled me that conservatives are not for that, because conservatives who argue that marriage is a great institution for society, they should be delighted that people want to join that institution. And so I was very proud that as a conservative party in the UK and then in government, we introduced it in the UK. And what's interesting, if you look at now the data, if you look at marriage rates, they're actually increasing and divorce rates are declining among the elite. And so it's actually what you're seeing over the last few years is that, as I put it in the book, is that marriage is basically becoming for rich people and for gay people. And I want it to be for everyone because it's good and it helps children grow. And it doesn't mean that it has to be one old-fashioned traditional view of it. As I also say, I'm a total believer in marriage equality. In fact, I believe in it so much, I even think straight people should get married if they're going to have children. And so I think we can move beyond that traditional kind of narrow way of looking at it in a way that brings people together and says, look, it's absolutely the case that it is in the best interest of all of us and individuals if if we achieve this very simple sounding goal that has been elusive, which is that every American child is raised in a stable, loving home. Now, that sounds so easy to say, but it's not happening.
Yeah, and I think this also connects to another topic that.
So can I just connect it back to populism? Sure. Because this is another thing I wanted to argue in this book, which is that when we think about populism, it's a pretty narrow set of issues that we typically talk about or hear about. It's trade and immigration and the elites and whatever. And if the real point about populism is to lift up working people and give them economic security and opportunity, we can't just talk about trade and immigration. It's got to be this wider set of issues, including family, because that's really where opportunity is incubated, but also schools and training, and there's a whole set of things way beyond the current narrow definition of what populism is. That's the connection. Yeah,
you do get into the book in others of these topics that are maybe more stereotypical when we think of that cloud of topics under populism.
Right.
So, for example, you talk about immigration and the way that this has, once again, balkanized our policy, become sort of a lightning rod. You basically argue that government should strive for zero illegal immigration, but should try to accommodate and welcome refugees, accommodate and welcome immigrants to a certain extent. And in the universe that you run in the Fox News world, I would imagine that that is a somewhat controversial position to take. So talk a little bit about how you've come to your particular balance on immigration and refugee admission, and how you think about that in the context that you're occupying in sort of the Fox News political world.
I think it's, funnily enough, I think it's less controversial than you may think. Because I think there's a fundamental point at the heart of it that I saw actually while working in the administration in the UK, which is that, and it's an argument that David Cameron made as Prime Minister, which I think is absolutely right, which is that public consent for immigration depends on the government's control of immigration, and that people are absolutely open to not just the idea and the fact of immigration, as long as they get a sense that it's being controlled. And the trouble is, it feels like it isn't. In the UK, it really wasn't, because of membership in the EU, which meant that you literally couldn't. There was free movement of people within the EU. And when the EU expands to 27 countries, and some of those countries don't have particularly strong border controls, that is a problem. And that was one of the that's why immigration was one of the driving factors in the Brexit debate. So I think that if you look at, let's just look at the Senator Perdue, what's it called, the RAISE Act, the Perdue-Tom Cotton bill that was, I think, a year or so ago. I had Senator Perdue on my show to talk about it. That actually is, to me, a kind of reasonable compromise which combines proper control, border control and a proper process, with an openness to refugees and immigrants. Now, you may argue about the level of legal immigration. I think their number is probably lower than other people would suggest, but that's a sort of reasonable conversation. At the moment, it's so emotive. It's like open borders or Fortress America, and I just think that's just ridiculous. There's a reasonable path through here, but you've got to have that reassurance of control.
So let's talk about the ugly aspects of this, because in the United States, but also in France, in the Netherlands, other places around the world where we've seen populist movements, particularly around this issue, we also see a surge of nativism, of nationalism, of racial discrimination. And I'm wondering how you propose to offer this populist view of immigration that would generally be aligned with the American right, but to stay away from some of the ugliness and the nativism that's associated with that.
Very much so. I mean, I think that's a key goal of what I'm trying to argue, and that's why I think it's important. That's literally why I chose the title for the book. It's also the theme of my show, positive populism, because I think that we've got to get away from that. I think that honestly, the answer is the same as the previous answer. I think you have that kind of rage because people sense that immigration is not, well, there's two things actually. First of all, that immigration is not being properly controlled. It's a free-for-all. But secondly, that there's another important piece missing, and I think we haven't talked about this yet, but I talk about it in the book. I think it's really important, is integration. It's not just immigration, but integration. And that notion, which I feel so much as someone who's come here, I've been here 6.5 years now, it's like, you come here, you want to be part of America, you love America, and you want to be 100% part of it. And I think that what's happened, certainly in Europe, has been a real social and economic disaster, which is the ideological approach of multiculturalism, which says that actually you don't have to subscribe to a common shared set of values or principles, or even cultural norms, for example, in relation to the role of women in society, or attitudes to, or homophobic attitudes, or speaking the language of the country you move to. All those things is, it's fine, we don't want to make a judgment, just do what you want. What it's ended up with is a very fragmented society, and I think that's one of the reasons you've got this toxic public debate. And I think that, therefore, controlling immigration and requiring integration, those are the two parts of it.
So we're going to move into audience questions in just a moment. So come up with the hard-hitting questions that you'd like to ask Steve. But before we do that, I'm just curious, as we were talking before, we described you as perhaps Trump curious. And in your book, you also offer some significant praise for Bernie Sanders. So I'm wondering, in a 2020 showdown between Trump and Bernie, who are you supporting?
You can't ask, that's a terrible question. I was very... funny enough, the other day I was on the Young Turks network with Cenk Uygur, who was, we had so much in common when we were talking about these things. I think that one of the things, I'm going to dodge your question, I'm really sorry, I'm just going to get that out there now. But I do think one of the things that I'm really trying to show, I'm glad you picked up on it, is I'm interested in that overlap between the left and right populism. To use shorthand, the Trump and Sanders populism, and to see whether actually that may provide a pathway to healing some of our divisions, and say, well, actually, if you had a really serious pro-worker agenda, you could get a lot of people behind that. And I think that we haven't seen that enough, but that could be one way through from a policy point of view. And it was interesting, right after the 2016 election, I was very interested that it was Bernie and Elizabeth Warren, actually, who immediately came out and said, if you do things that are going to help our workers and so on, we'll be there with you. It was very interesting to see them, not the establishment Democrats, kind of showing a willingness to work. Now, I'm afraid that climate obviously hasn't persisted, to use a word that certainly Elizabeth Warren would be happy to accept. But I don't think that we should give up on that idea of an alliance between the left and right populisms, not on everything, but on certain policy areas that can certainly help workers.
All I'm saying, in the Bernie Trump showdown, you're going to have to pull the lever, although you're not a citizen yet, so
Not
I guess
yet,
maybe you
no,
can
exactly.
sidestep once again.
Continue to dodge for another couple of... Well, actually, no, because I'm hoping to start the process next year.
Okay, well, get ready. This is part of the burden of American citizenship. Who has a question that they would like to ask? Down in the front.
One issue that is uniting the left and the right populists is universal basic income, and that's what I've been working on. And would you comment on that idea and what you think and where it might be going?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a. It's right towards the beginning of the book. I addressed that issue, the issue behind that, which is the economic security, the lack of the collapse of economic security for half the country, roughly. I totally agree with the goals of universal basic income, but I don't think it's exactly the right way to go. I've got a different approach, which I call the business-friendly living wage. But we're all working at this from the same area. It's interesting. You saw Amazon's announcement yesterday. Senator Sanders and Ro Khanna 2 weeks ago introduced a bill which was aiming at exactly the same issue that you work on and that I write about in the book, which is the fact that you've got so many employers who pay people, millions of workers are paid at a level they can't live on. And that is basically a subsidy to those big corporations because they're paying their workers too little to live on, but they get away with it because the taxpayer tops up those workers' wages with welfare in one form or another, whether that's earned income tax credit or food stamps or whatever. That is basically a subsidy to business. So it's interesting, like maybe a sort of distinction between the left and right populism and the UBI, which is their bill, the Sanders-Ro Khanna bill, was to say, right, we'll tax you that amount. We'll look at the amount of money that the government basically subsidizes Amazon, the amount of money that is required to top up the pay of the workers. We'll tax you that money to sort of punish you for not paying them enough. My argument was, rather than doing that, why don't we do this? This is the idea in my book, which is raise the minimum wage, actually way beyond $15 an hour in some places, to the living wage, literally to the level that you need to live on without any kind of additional support. That varies around the country, obviously based on housing costs and transportation costs, but there are organizations that literally work out the living wage in place by place. Make employers pay the living wage everywhere, but in order to make it affordable for business, reduce and to make sure that they don't lay people off or replace workers with automation because they're now more expensive, you cut their taxes, cut their payroll taxes or corporate taxes by the same amount, so the net effect on business is neutral. So you just what you're really doing is taking out the government middleman, which is what happens now, which is the government is taking money from the companies and then giving it back to the workers with this ridiculous bureaucracy with no reason at all. You just require them to pay. Everyone should be able to live on what they earn if you work full time. Now, the UBI, the reason I don't go that far is that I think that notion of working for a living is really important to people, not just economically, but in terms of their self-worth and ambition and sense of who they are. And I know you've heard that argument many times, but I still won't go all the way to supporting universal basic income that's not attached to work.
Do we have another question in the back?
In framing, family togetherness, what is your thought, if you haven't spoken about it, because I came a little late, about justice reform, prison reform, rehabilitation? I think that our war on drugs, I don't know how it is in Britain, but has been one of the most devastating forces in terms of families.
Yeah.
The most devastating forms of, like destroying communities. And in addition to that, what do you think in terms of religion and spiritual organizations playing a part in whatever like societal structures that address human needs?
So we're almost out of time, so you're going to have to give the Cliff Notes version of that answer.
Okay, so I completely agree with how important that problem is. I think I can connect the two. One of the best things that we worked on in the UK government actually was exactly this. It was a anti-recidivism measure. There was a particular jail, Peterborough Jail. It became quite a well-known experiment where we implemented something called social impact bonds, where you would basically, to ease that transition back into society from someone who's been in jail, to make sure they don't reoffend. They come out of jail, they got no job, no income. It's so easy for them to slip back and to not become strong family and community members as you would want. So we put together a program where you would basically pay organizations, including faith-based organizations, to work directly with those former inmates to reintegrate them. But they would be paid based on their ability to get a job and meet certain goals. And it was incredibly successful. I think it's now being imitated. I think Bloomberg tried to pick it up and do it in New York when he was still mayor. So I think that there are ways you could design policy better to handle that problem.
These ideas and many more in Steve Hilton's book, Positive Populism. There's a book signing down below, so come purchase a copy if you feel compelled, or throw it at him if you don't. And thank you so much for joining us. We'll look forward to seeing you around the festival.
Thank you very much. Thank you.